Transparency is becoming a journey, I think, through that International Maritime Organization as well. So we're at one point, we've got there, and that's from flags as well. I mean, we get audited, we have to be able to demonstrate we're meeting all our international obligations now. But for shipping and that transparency journey, it will require digitalization, it will require more information from just about every source, from flag, from the owner, from the ship, from the class society. It's that data package is just going to get bigger.
That is the voice of Cameron Mitchell, director of the Isle of Man Ship Registry. He's one of the many experts that I've had the pleasure of talking to on my podcast. Today, we will be diving into the topic of digitization and how it's changing the ship registration process, as well as discussing some of the innovative ways that IOM is supporting seafarers' mental health and well-being. But before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone to follow our podcast to stay up to date with latest episodes. And if you're enjoying the show, please tell a friend or colleague who you think would benefit from our discussions. We rely on your support to keep bringing you informative and engaging content. So without further ado, let's jump right into the conversation with Cameron. Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. Joining me on today's podcast is Cameron Mitchell, director of the Isle of Man Ship Registry. The Isle of Man Ship Registry is one of the world's leading registers of ships and super yachts. And I've personally gotten to know Cameron over the past few years as a Sea Trade Maritime ambassador and at a few industry events, including the recent CMA trade show and conference this past March in Stamford, Connecticut. Cameron, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. Very nice to be here.
This is going to be a good one here because we're going to touch on a lot of great subjects. So you're at the Isle of Man. You're the director of the ship registry. What's going on these days there with the registry and kind of what you guys are doing?
I suppose COVID gave us a lot of time to think, Chris, and I hate to say use it as a catalyst, but I think it was to make us relook at how we operate, our operating model in particular. What we might want to change. And obviously that includes continuing our digital journey. So, I mean, I think thinking back, I think we started our digitalization or our digital journey back in 2007. We were one of the first flags in the world to create a digital electronic register of ships and yachts. So we moved away from the big old books, which some of you will remember from the good old days when everything was written by hand, and then recorded by hand and filed by hand. And, it was a progression into a modern ship registry, I think. So an example would be pre our electronic registration system, about 25% of everything that we sent out to clients had mistakes in it, be it an IMO number, be it a spelling mistake, be it a typo. Those were the good old days, I suppose. But, as the world's moved on, you can't have ships sailing around the world with certification that's wrong. So the big advantage of the introduction of the electronic register was one set of information entered once, there forever, everything that went out from the same source of information. So our errors went from about 25% to less than 0.5% within about 2 years, I think.
Well, it's really funny you say that about, having corrections and errors. I mean, when I was a shipbroker, they used to call me Correction Recap Chris because, you would send something out and you're like, oh, man, I left the word subject somewhere in here. So I don't think it was necessarily, let's say, unique to ship registries, as I say, but certainly you guys got to reflect. What other things when you talk about this and kind of as you evolved you're evolving your leadership of the Isle of Man Register, what other things were you reflecting on in COVID? I imagine a lot of it was digital, but there had to be a lot of other things that you guys looked at as well.
I think there was. I think there was a realization probably that due to COVID, we relied very heavily on our business development managers, and we're not unique in that front. So we have representatives at various maritime hubs around the world. The importance of them during COVID, I mean, that they were a saver for us, really. And to expand on that, I suppose now, so currently we have Greece, Tokyo, Singapore, Japan, and Germany. And we'll be expanding within the next 12 months to Middle East, probably Dubai, Hong Kong, South Korea, and we think Florida for the yachting sector.
Mm.
So when we've proved the model now, we've proved that they can support us when we can't get to them. They can stay in touch with clients. It's nice for clients to have someone on the ground that they can just knock on the door, so to speak, and ask them to pop round for 10 minutes. They have an issue, all of those types of things. So that was a we knew they were good, but we didn't realize how good they were, I suppose.
That's a really interesting thing because COVID gave the opportunity to work from home or work remotely. And again, I'm not saying anything that's unique to shipping or anything, but certainly, now you're getting this push for everybody to go back in the office. And what's happened is there's a lot of people who say, wait a minute, the remote stuff, and obviously we're a more naturally inclined business to be remote because we are global in nature, and to have those people on the ground closer to the clients, whether it's in Florida, whether it's like you said, in Dubai or other places, it's perfectly, there's a value there that maybe was unrealized before.
I think so. I think, business centric or central business, I don't know. And I think that is traditionally how we were, where we operated from the Isle of Man. Our business was in the Isle of Man, and if you wanted to do business with us, you had to get in touch with the Isle of Man. But I think COVID absolutely showed us that. Showed us that we have the capabilities to work wherever we may be in the world. So we have an electronic database. So it has all our survey information, all our ship information. So our representatives in Singapore access the same system as we do in the Isle of Man. It's easy. It's not, we don't have to be there in order to do that business. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it. We've decided to carry on with a hybrid working model. There is benefits obviously for some people, and there's the other side of that as well for some people. But we're not precious about it. If you want to work from home 3 days a week, you can, and spend 2 days in the office. If you want to spend 4 days in the office and work one day from home, then you can. We've kept it as flexible as we can to meet, I suppose, our staff team's needs. Be they with young children, I don't know, pets, a sunny day.
Yeah. A sunny day. Yeah. I think I know personally, I work 100% remote. And I've truly embraced it. I do miss certain aspects, which is part of the reason why I have a podcast, is because, I enjoyed the social aspect and meeting and getting out and talking to people, which is something that I guess I didn't realize I missed until I missed it for a long time. And you guys seem to be, not only kind of expanding people wise, but kind of, I've noticed recently you guys are more and more expanding onto bigger ships beyond yachts. It seems to be maybe that's part of your outreach and expansion internally there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've always, going back to sort of the early 2000s, we didn't really have any of the big yachts. It was all shipping, and we saw steady growth, and we have seen steady growth till about 2018, 19. Then there was various things going on around the world that the Strait of Hormuz, I think we're allowed to talk about it. There was a bit of political unrest there, and the British flag or the British red ensign became a slightly riskier choice, I suppose, for clients for commercial reasons more than anything else. So our tonnage did drop a bit. We dropped from 14th largest in the world to 18th largest in the world, but we're beginning to see that turn around again now. And I think that's a lot to do with our BDMs and the effort they put in around the world of going and visiting clients, keeping those relationships going, reminding them that we're still here, we're still doing business, and also bringing them up to date on latest developments. So we brought in a sort of green fees scheme, we've called it, for alternative fuels. We brought that in April 22, where we discount annual registration fees for clients that are spending money on innovation for all intents and purposes. So if you're investing in LNG dual fueled or LPG dual fueled engines, or methanol, ammonia, hydrogen to fuel, batteries, We want to know about it. And we'll reward you for that. It's not a reward that's substantial in terms of the investment, but at least it's an acknowledgement that, us as a flag, we appreciate that. We're all on a journey now to decarbonisation and alternative fuels. So I think it's important that we credit ship owners and operators for making those decisions.
To me, that's, I guess every little bit helps, and certainly recognition. And you see people who do kind of wear those badges proudly if they're from, whether it's their flag state or I know Carlene and her group at NAMEPA, they kind of do the same sort of thing. It may not mean a lot in terms of actual revenue, but I think as more and more people start to look at that as a maybe as a differentiator over time, and whether it's a flag state or a charter looking at how does my ship perform. We talked a little bit about, obviously decarbonization goes hand in hand with digitization. And you talked about, you guys had the first registry that must have helped in some of that decarbonization, because it's easier to keep track of things. I imagine that, electronic ship registers now are a little bit more, let's say, ubiquitous in the market, but certainly being the first gives a little bit of advantage. But you talk about digitization, there had been a lot of good things, not only for the register, but for the industry as a whole. What other things have you guys seen from your view about, the impact of digitization, and not necessarily with decarbonization, but with just in general?
I think one of the big pieces of work, I think we started in 2017 issuing digital electronically signed certification. So we went completely away from printing things out and sending them halfway around the world by courier to get to ships. And I think, again, we're one of the first flags to do that. I mean, the savings on office stationery and paper and all of those things is just phenomenal. You can have a ship can register, and you can have its certification on board a minute after it's registered. Whereas before, you had to make sure you'd sent certificates to the class surveyor or the Isle of Man surveyor who was on board. They had to actually take them with them before you could register a ship. So the whole process of registration in the last sort of, I suppose, 5 to 6 years is a much quicker operation, or certainly is for us. I think the other thing that we've noticed is the ability to transfer and pull in data from open sources from wherever it might be. That data journey, certainly since the start of COVID, and the broadband width that must be being used now across the world to get data from ships compared to, pre-2020 must be massive. I mean, I've no idea how much it's growing, but it must be huge. And I don't think that's going to change now. I think that data analytics part will become more and more important moving forwards, especially with things like MARPOL Annex 6 and transparency and declarations around emissions and all of those things. We're on a journey now where, and I think I may have talked about it a bit at CMA, where transparency is becoming a journey, I think, through that International Maritime Organization as well. So we're at one point, we've got there, and that's from flags as well. I mean, we get audited. We have to be able to demonstrate we're meeting all our international obligations now. But for shipping and that transparency journey, it will require digitalization. It will require more information from just about every source, from flag, from the owner, from the ship, from the class society. It's that data package is just going to get bigger.
And I think that one of the things that you kind of touched upon a little bit is transparency and sharing of data. I've always approached it kind of from the commercial side. So, where is the line being drawn, right? Like, okay, pre-fixture stuff, I don't want to get too much into it other than the basics. Post-fixture, maybe we could do some more sharing because we have a joint interest in the vessel itself. You're in a unique situation because where are some of those lines? And I think that that's probably what you're talking about with the whole idea of a journey, is where are these lines being drawn in terms of what's being shared, what's not being shared. Like you said, taking over a ship, re-registering a ship, certainly the speed, and like you said, for some flag states, it's gotten a lot faster and a lot quicker, and kind of some interesting things. So that's the good part. Talk a little bit about like this, and kind of from your view a little bit, is there anything bad, especially when it comes to the seafarers side of things, being an ex-seafarer? Do you
Yeah.
see anything like maybe it's almost you've gone from I know how to do it this way, now all of a sudden drinking water from a fire hose? Is there something there from a seafarer side that you kind of go, we need to consider it because it could actually have a downside?
Pros and cons. I think for my generation, from being at sea, I sent postcards, Chris.
So did I. So did I. I remember that.
And
I remember to get letters. I go, ooh, I got a letter.
yeah,
Ooh.
and you used to get ashore, you got shore leave in those days, and I think, well, hopefully we'll get back to that. And if you're lucky, you got to a seafarer's mission or a club, or you got to somewhere where you could do a satellite phone call home, maybe, and that was your communication style, and that's everyone was the same, and you sort of got on with it. So I think we have to be careful now of, or mindful, I wouldn't say careful, we have to be mindful now of the generation that our youth are in. And I had the example given to me. So if you were my daughter, 16 years old, decided to do a cadetship, decided to go to sea, somebody who has the option to be 24/7 connected to everything now, I don't know all the different things, TikTok, WeChat, whatever it might be, WhatsApp,
Instagram, yeah, WhatsApp,
Instagram,
yeah.
all of those things, and she has them all, I'm sure. But we put them in a position of isolation. So
Mm.
if they go to sea now, we are socially isolating them from their natural environment, is what I'd say. And I think we have to be very mindful of that. So yes, I think Wi-Fi is really important for them to stay connected to the modern world, but it has its downsides as well. What we don't want to get is in a position of the seafarers at sea and his wife's contacting him. It could be on any messenger service saying the washing machine's broken down. You can't do anything about it. There's no point in those sorts of things. But for a seafarer, where it can be a fairly stressful job, never normally quiet, always normally busy, to have another thing in your mind to worry about that's going on at home isn't particularly advantageous. So I think we have to be careful. And I know there's a lot of good work going on by various charitable organizations to provide, courses, training, if you like, for families of seafarers in various
Mm.
parts around the world, which sort of says, yes, in an emergency, I wouldn't personally contact your husband or whoever it might be, your partner at sea. Why don't you contact the company first so they can make sure he's in a safe environment on board? Then they can be told, then they can contact. It's those types of things. We just have to be very careful how we use that technology. And again, we had logs that were paper. We had oil record books that were paper. We had everything was paper, wasn't it? That's the way it was. And now our seafarers are expected to use some very different tools when they're at sea.
Uh, Yeah,
Yeah,
and I think that goes into a little bit of the training, and certainly I would imagine even the training for if you have somebody, again, it's more in play now, but certainly somebody that was used to registering a ship, or what was expected if a captain is signing off a ship, or the ship is sold, and they're going to re-register the captain. Okay, I did this before with the paperweight. Well, now you're telling me this electronic document's good enough. Like I think that from a seafarer's point of view, that could be also a little bit of an interesting kind of shift, right? Because they're doing their job differently because of digitization and the way that you guys are moving forward.
absolutely. And I think you know, even now you're beginning to see, STCW courses online where you can do everything apart from the practical elements. And is that a good thing? I think it probably is. If seafarers have the time and they can do that on board a ship, and it saves them having to go home, then go away to a
Then
training
go
course.
away. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I had that discussion actually with Lourdes Evans of Kongsberg. We've talked about that and their focus on doing training, bridge training. and that the seafarers can get a lot of the work done ahead of time. So they could do a lot of the book work. You know, we talk about bridge training, you know, done and okay. And then, so instead of spending, like, I think the point that you were making, you know, I go home to my family, and, you know, it's not the family in, you know, New York and New Jersey, like, or New York where I grew up. It's my family in Manila. And then I have to go to a different place, you know, in the family in the Philippines, and have to go to Manila, which I don't live in Manila, for for a 2-week training. Maybe that 2-week training becomes a 3-day training, right? Or a 1-week training.
Absolutely.
And that definitely has a benefit. But I think, I think it becomes a question of, does it become a distraction? How much of a distraction for seafarers? Certainly that's something I've gotten away from, but and the connectivity definitely comes up, is how connected you want to be. Salvatore D'Amico on the podcast, he had the same sort of concerns. Like, you get like all this information. I mean, I see it just, you know, as we're recording, you know, if, you know, my spouse, my wife says, oh, you know, something's going on with this kid or that kid, you know, or whatever. It's like, you get distracted.
And I think that, you know, unfortunately for us as a flag, we had the worst kind of example of that ship shore connection. So we lost the first trip cadet off one of our ships, middle of the Northern Pacific, I think it was, if I remember correctly. First trip at sea. Spent 2 years at college. Had done well at college. Had been on the ship for 6 weeks, and was happy. You know, there was no problems when we interviewed the rest of the crew. He was slightly conscious that he was a little bit behind on some of his work, but wasn't anxious, wasn't nervous. According to the rest of the crew, behaving normally. And as part of his training, he was on the 12 to 4 watch on the bridge. And the second mate had said to him, I think along the lines of, you know, you have got a bit of training to catch up with. I think it was lifeboats, LSA equipment, you know, computer generated training, or the training syllable that he had on board. And the second mate said, you know, why don't you go and spend a couple hours catching up with that? He left the bridge about, I think it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. Went to the training room where the computer and everything was set up. We know this because he logged into the computer, so we could see that he was logged in. And we know that there was 3 bursts of Wi-Fi activity to his phone. Then we know that he wasn't on board at 2:45 in the morning. You know, that for us, that was a terrible event. I mean, absolutely terrible event. Number one, it's somebody so young, you know, their first experience of sea. So from a flag perspective, we started to look at, can we influence that? Is there a way that we could influence that? So we developed a seafarer welfare app, which is currently out there in the market. That was our response, I suppose, to try and engage with the mental health and well-being of seafarers. It was about trying to break that sort of isolation, that cabin isolation. So there's lots of different things within the app, but one of them was physical exercise, where it can be done in the gym with a group of people. There was live training classes, you know, metaball and all of these types of things. And then there was other stuff for mental health and well-being. For us, it was just a way, for us to try and engage and alter what could be a different outcome. One of the other great things that we got from that was ISWAN. So their 24/7 emergency call line was on there. It was on the app. They could press a button, connect with that if they felt they really needed to talk to somebody. We also got chaplaincy services involved. So Stella Maris, the way that we did it in the app is we got all of their locations around the world, all of where they have a service, and put them into the app. So if somebody needed to have a talk with somebody the next port they arrived in, they could contact them via the app and say, I'll be in at 8 o'clock in the morning. Chaplain, can you come down? Or priest, can you come down and have a conversation? So those little things hopefully make a difference, you know, and you could not do that without the digital age we have.
Yeah, it's interesting because I look at that as tragic as I don't have anything to compare it. I guess the closest thing that, you know, a friend of mine was on a ship where one of the cooks passed away, but naturally, right? Just, you know, had a heart attack, and that was it. So not the same thing of of what you're saying, but certainly having those digital tools, and I believe Salvatore D'Amico as well. D'Amico said the same sort of thing, which was we're having tools where people can connect, where people, and those tools even 10 years ago weren't really available, right? And it was a lot on the captain or the chief officer or the chief engineer to kind of not only, command the ship or command an engine room and assure the safety. You say safety and welfare of the crew, you always think of physical safety, but then there is, and I think COVID highlighted a lot of, not just for seafarers but for everybody, mental health, getting up
Yeah.
and walking around. I mean, like I said, I still work from my house. One of the things that I have to be careful about, and again, I'm not in any mental distress, is to basically get outside,
Yeah.
do some physical, like go for a 10-minute walk, walk the dog up the street and back and things like that. And I think it's so important to have those reminders, especially at sea, especially when you feel more isolated, as we all did to different degrees in COVID. I think it's important, and glad to see that Flag is not only just working it isolated as Flag's problem, but as engaging other seafaring kind of support services, whether it be Stella Maris or other ones like that. We also had on Reverend Nesselhut from SCI, and he talked about, he deals a lot with inland folks, so that is, they never lose satellite connection, email connection. He told an equally difficult story of a seafarer, somebody working on the Western Rivers. The person's wife and one of their children died in a car accident while he was working on the boat. And he's getting text from the neighbor about that. And not even, they can't, the company couldn't even, he's getting text from neighbors while, and I don't know what capacity it was piloting or whether it was a deckhand or something. That's got to, so that it goes back to your point of how is there, without being like Orwellian overlords, how do you have some control so that, like you said, do it in a way that is safe? Are you in a safe, because if you have a guy who's piloting, if you ever seen pictures of these tugs and barges going up the Western Rivers, it still blows my head how they do that, 1,000 feet long, and they're turning, a half a mile before. It's pretty amazing. And you get distracted with that.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on there. I mean, obviously, the number one is the mental health of the person steering, but then you have a serious issue with, whether it's grain, whether it's, chemicals or other stuff. I mean,
yeah. It's I think, and that is key, and I don't know if we've found that balance yet. I know people are trying to find the right balance, but I don't know.
I think it's interesting because I think one of my questions as we start to kind of wind up here is always, what would you make? Why would you want somebody to come into the maritime industry, right? And I think one of the things, how do we make it more attractive, or why would you tell somebody yes, jump in? And certainly one of the things that we've kind of talked about here and during my other shows is connectivity, being connected, but certainly I think it's almost being connected in a way that it works for new people coming onto the coming into the industry. And I do think one of the things that's kind of cool is that, and I think it's good because I also see it with my children, is that mental health isn't as taboo as it once was. That they're more accepting of, whether it's an app, whether it's a person, a therapist. I saw something recently where it said it showed different generations' reaction to therapy, and it was like the current generation, Gen Z, saying, "Oh, you don't have a therapist? You must be a maniac." So, whereas the older generations had different things. So I think that's certainly one thing. What else would you, in addition to seafaring, you have a lot of exposure to shoreside positions. What would you say to somebody who's thinking about coming into our industry?
I'll be perfectly honest. I love our industry. I just, the people that are involved in our industry, their willingness to talk to you about more or less any subject. It's, I think it's. I mean, I was 17. I think I was 17 when I went to sea, or when I went to college. Certainly, maybe 18 my first trip at sea. I never really looked back. I never really looked back. I think and I hope it's still there, that companionship, camaraderie, yes. on board that you used to get when you're all working together for a goal, I suppose, be it a job in the engine room doing a main engine piston or a liner, and everyone would be there, and people would be having tantrums and there'd be spanners flying about, but you all got on with it.
Yeah.
You all got on with it. You did it as a team, you pulled together, and when it was all up and running again, the chief would go, "Oh, well done, boys. That's great job, great job." The captain might come down and buy you a couple of beers or something like that. And it was, it's a team effort, and that's the thing about being at sea. You have to be part of that team. I think you have to be able to prepare to work in a team. Number one, I think the difficulty may come, I think, in the future and future generations is whether they understand that hierarchical need, which I think is still there. You have to have someone in charge. You have to have a captain who's in charge of steering the ship. You have to have a chief that's in charge of the engine room. That's the way it works. And you've all got your different roles and responsibilities. But I remember thinking back and name a job where at 19 when I got my ticket, I think it was, or 20 when I got my officer of the watch ticket. Name a job at 20 years old where you're in charge of, what was it said back those days, 60 million pounds worth of ship for 24 hours in the engine room when you're on UMS, as a 20-year-old. Not a bad responsibility, is it?
Yeah, that was always that was the same thing, I always looked at it because I was on tankers, 21, 20, well, I got my ticket, but then I sailed deckhand, so I was 22 and sailing, and it was an MR basically. So how 300,000 barrels, and roll that into the number of gallons of gasoline and what the value was on the in the market. You look at that, that's pretty good. I do think the one thing that I fell in love with the industry, and obviously the shoreside stuff, I absolutely love it. One of the things that I heard, and I think we heard it recently together, is one thing that I think the industry could benefit from is we see this ashore, but certainly afloat would be interesting, is mentoring, and I think to have people
Yes.
who would mentor, to have somebody who's a chief engineer mentor a cadet, mentor a third assistant, and just not necessarily like, well, that's, when it gets to this temperature, it does, no, but like, this is how you deal with that captain or the bunker people or this, and kind of, it doesn't have to be a hard mentorship in terms of formalized, but having that informal thing. I think that generationally, I think it works really well with any generation, but you can kind of see, because it gives a little bit more of that collaborative feel. And I think, yes, there is a need for hierarchy, but there could be parts of the job that's more collaborative in nature. And I think that could be a certainly a thing that we see. Certainly ashore, it helps as well. So anyway, I always like to ask this question as we wrap up. Are you reading anything good?
I wouldn't say it's particularly good. I quite I quite like. I normally have two or three different books on the go at any one time. So a piece of non-fiction, a biography or autobiography of somebody's that I'm interested in, and then for some reason, since I was in my late teens, I quite often fall back or have in the background a fantasy novel of some type.
Okay.
And I don't know where that comes from. I've just never quite got rid of it. Maybe the belief that I'll be a technical wizard one day. I don't
know. There you go.
But yeah, I think again, I do a lot for my mental health. I think I find reading, it can be a book, it can be a Kindle book. I don't tend to do the magazines.
Yeah.
I do a bit of broadsheets, the news and stuff. But my end of the day always finishes off with me reading, be one of those formats, depending on my mood, probably, to relax, to shut off after a day, to wind down, to get the brain to stop thinking about everything else. And I do the same with my kids. I encourage them to read, last thing at night before they go to bed, although not preferably not on a white screen, because I believe that keeps you awake now.
Oh yeah, that's a big thing. That's a big thing. Yeah, I try to read sometimes. A little more, a little more successful sometimes than others. So anyway, this was a great conversation, Cameron. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it. And, good luck with kind of rolling out those kind of improvements to the Seafarers digitally. I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. And we've heard a lot of people trying to do that. So glad to see that, you guys are doing that there at the Isle of Man. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Chris. Pleasure to speak to you again. Hopefully catch up soon.
Absolutely.